health, and in some cases people becoming ill, is food security. And there's a severe problem of food insecurity in my community, but I know it's not unique to my community. It's across the province. And when this was produced, 18% of the members of my community were living with a low income, and many of them were experiencing food insecurity. And this type of situation can contribute to diabetes, as is discussed here, or potentially other chronic diseases. And to quote one of there's quotes that are pulled from community discussions to create these reports, and one of the quotes says, hidden behind that, okay, we're talking about social determinants of health. The determinant of health here is income and social status, physical environment, and personal health practices and coping skills. And then the quote is, hidden behind that is a large number of working poor who are maybe not to the point that they have to access a food bank, but the quality of food that they're getting is, the quality of their nutrition is way below standard. And so we have people who might be accessing a food bank, and I know that people who work in food banks and people that try to provide food security for New Brunswickers are working hard and are doing what they can with their budgets, but there may be gaps in the nutrition. And then people who aren't accessing food banks but don't have a lot of income may not be able to purchase what they need to be able to meet their nutrition requirements. And so there's a huge gap here, and this is a societal problem, and there are institutional factors here. And I think that needs to be a big discussion when we're looking at this issue of chronic diseases and of diabetes. One thing that I appreciate that's in the original motion that I would assume and I would hope would be carried through to the amendment is to assist with the costs associated with having a chronic disease or with having diabetes. I know that once someone has a chronic disease, there are a lot of expenses that need to be incurred, and everything from the test strips for diabetes, I know those are extremely expensive, to other factors, and luckily we have, I would argue, a superior healthcare system to for example, our neighbors down south and to some other countries, but there are still expenses that people in New Brunswick have to incur when they're unwell, and it's very unfortunate that sometimes they might have to make difficult choices because it weighs so heavily on their pocketbook. I was pleased, speaking of institutional things, I was pleased with Canada's Food Guide finally being revised, because I also think there's a problem with the way that we have thought about nutrition and the way we have educated people about nutrition for a long time. And I think Canada's Food Guide, the revised version, is definitely a big step in the right direction and has better choices being recommended to people. And one of the key things with a lot of these chronic diseases is looking at the prevention part, and that's something that a lot of these organizations are talking about. Obviously, we want to support people once they have diabetes or another chronic disease, but what can we do to prevent that from happening and reduce the number of people who have to experience that? And for example, Canadian Diabetes Association has a whole list related to sugar. And not everyone likes to talk about sugar. And I'm right now thinking of the debacle in New York where the mayor wanted to tax soft drinks and then they wanted to throw them out. And people get really upset about sugar. But the reality is that sugar, and I'm talking about free sugars, I'm not just talking about any carbohydrate, I'm talking about sugars that are removed from their original source, so they're taken out of the plant source, for example sugar cane, and they're put in something else, like a sugar-sweetened beverage. And And the studies prove that this is a big problem. This is significantly negatively impacting the global population, the Canadian population, New Brunswick's population, and there are health organizations that advocate for changes, and they're recommending things like having policies to address sugar-sweetened beverages and where they're available, how much they cost, and the marketing of these things to children. Because we've talked a bit about adults, and we've talked about children. There's gestational diabetes, which comes up, and when it comes to these things, diet and exercise are so important, and it won't address every concern, but we really could be doing better around policies around these things. And looking at the statistics from the health and economic impact of a sugar-sweetened beverage tax in Canada, which was, it's a report that was done by the Applied Health Sciences Department, the University of Waterloo, which was partially funded by Heart and Stroke Foundation, Diabetes Canada, Cancer Association, Childhood Obesity Foundation. In 2015, Canadians purchased an average of about a can of pop a day. And what their study found is that at current consumption levels, sugar-sweetened beverage consumption would contribute to approximately 25,000 new cases of type 2 diabetes annually over the next 25 years. That is just staggering. And we're talking about a healthcare system that is overburdened. We're talking about rates of diabetes, among other chronic diseases, which some are mentioned here that are impacted by this. For example, over the next 25 years, an estimated 32,000 deaths in Canada of cardiovascular disease will be due to intake of sugar-sweetened beverages. Again, staggering the number of people whose health is compromised and, frankly, whose lives will be taken by the sugar-sweetened beverages that are out there and that are being consumed. And so one thing that, to go back to something else I was saying, is that we need to ensure that we are not allowing marketing of those types of things to children. And there's precedent for this type of law to exist in other countries. And I think some of these ideas about what environment are we living in, what are children, for example, having access to in terms of advertisements, what drinks and what foods are made available to people. These are really important things that need to be considered when we are looking at strategies to address things like diabetes and other chronic diseases, because ultimately our system is going to crack under the pressure of just constantly rising levels of chronic diseases. And there is a lot that can be done at the prevention end. And it's really unfortunate that we have not seen enough of that over the years, but we have the science and we have the studies and we have examples of good public health policy in other places that could be used to guide whether it ends up being a primary healthcare framework on chronic disease prevention and management or a comprehensive diabetes strategy if the amendment is not adopted, because the prevention part needs to be key. We obviously need to support those who have healthcare challenges in the form of diabetes or other chronic diseases. However, if we can make our society as a whole healthier by addressing people, what our population is eating and drinking, and what access they have to education around these things, making sure also, like I said, that we're addressing things like food security and poverty, because ultimately it's not without prevention, then these other things will not be attainable. The budget just won't allow for it. So I appreciate, Mr. Speaker, the chance to speak to the amendment on motion 59. Thank you.
The member for Moncton South.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to speak today in support of Motion 59 and a little tentative on the amendment, but our motion, Mr. Speaker, calls for government to immediately renew the lapsed provincial comprehensive diabetes strategy. The renewal was intended to provide additional financial support for people living with diabetes, since the costs with medications, monitoring devices, blood glucose testing supplies, and insulin delivery devices can be a burden and thereby can also be a detriment to managing the disease and preventing further, even more costly complications. Why do I think it's important to recommit to this diabetes strategy fully and wholly? Well, I'm worried about just folding it into a management plan for all chronic pain, though I do agree with the government that this is needed. A primary healthcare strategy is needed. We have a lot of chronic diseases, but I just don't necessarily think that diabetes may get the attention that it needs if it's folded in with a comprehensive strategy. I also think it's not good enough that we focus just on prevention and treatment, but also on financial and educational supports to people with diabetes so that we can help them to self-manage this life-altering disease. So first thing, I think I will give some descriptions of the disease and recommended treatment for managing it. I'll talk about some of the risks associated with improperly managing it, and I'll outline the prevalence and incidence of diabetes in New Brunswick and, Mr. Speaker, the huge cost to the healthcare system. And end with why the strategy for comprehensive diabetes is so important. As my colleague who brought this motion forward said, it would be a tragedy not to renew it because renewing it asserts it as a priority. Diabetes is a complicated, chronic, and challenging disease that occurs when the body either cannot produce insulin or cannot properly use the insulin that it does produce. It's a progressive disease that affects the body's ability to regulate the amount of glucose in the blood. And while sadly diabetes has no cure yet, it can be managed through a personalized combination of lifestyle approaches and medications. And some of these, as some of my colleagues were saying, can be managed through some lifestyle choices. But it's not as easy as always making choices about a lifestyle. Sometimes people's financial situations, people's social upbringing, people's environmental circumstances intervene in having full choice. So there are two types of diabetes, and I wanted to raise these because they're different. Type 1 is an autoimmune disorder where the pancreas suddenly stops producing insulin, and it's often occurring in childhood, and hence why it was formerly called juvenile diabetes. This type of diabetes is not preventable, and there are no modifiable risk factors. We tend to think all diabetes is preventable. This is not. The treatment involves a daily injection of insulin, and about 10% of the population has this, type 1. Type 2 diabetes, on the other hand, formerly referred to as adult onset diabetes, mellitus, is a disease that increases in frequency with advancing age. Individuals can still produce insulin, but they do not produce enough to meet their body's needs. This type of diabetes is not an autoimmune disorder. And there are a number of risk factors. Some are controllable and some are not. These include genetics, age, and race factors. Those are pretty hard to control. But there are other factors like being overweight or obese, having high blood pressure, having high bad cholesterol or low good cholesterol, or even having polycystic ovarian syndrome. And about 90% of the population has this type 2 diabetes. So both types have some similar symptoms, and there are some differences. However, the stigmas tend to apply to all persons with diabetes, and so not only do diabetics suffer from physical, mental, social, and financial costs, but there are a multitude of broad ways that people experience stigma and stereotypes. Diabetes puts people also at high risk of secondary complications like heart attack, stroke, vision loss, kidney disease, and even amputation. For instance, people with diabetes are over 3 times more likely to be hospitalized with cardiovascular disease, 12 times more likely with end-stage renal disease, and almost 20 times more likely with non-traumatic lower limb amputation. Foot ulceration actually affects an estimated 15 to 25% of people with diabetes in their lifetime. And in fact, 1/3 of amputees in 2011-2012 were done on people reporting a diabetic foot wound. I know, having worked with the homeless population for so many years, I have seen a lot of this. Diabetes complications are associated also with premature death. It can reduce the lifespan by 5 to 15 years. It's estimated that at least 1 in every 10 deaths in Canadian adults was attributable to diabetes in 2008-2009. It contributes to 30% of strokes, 40% of heart attacks, 50% of kidney failure that requires dialysis, and 70% of, like I said, lower limb amputations. It's the leading cause of vision loss. In fact, the risk of blindness in people with diabetes is up to 25 times higher than those without. It's the leading cause of acquired blindness in Canadians under age 50. Diabetic retinopathy affects 500,000 Canadians, and the risk of blindness in people with them being so much higher means that it requires attention. As I said, there's a mental component of this too, a mental health. The prevalence of clinically relevant depressive symptoms among people with diabetes is about 30%. The reverse can also happen in that people with depression have an approximately 60% increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes. So you can see the complications are many. So the treatment requires individualized response. One way to manage it is through self-monitoring of blood sugar, which means drawing a sample of blood from the fingertip.
Member, there's just 10 minutes left, so the closing remarks are to the member from Council Dallas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise to close the debate. I'd like to thank the seconder of the motion, the honourable member from Kent South, and I really appreciated his experience, as he mentioned that he has a condition and it runs in the family, and I think it served to highlight the importance of this topic. I want to also thank all of the members from all sides who participated in the debate in a meaningful way, and as one member closely said, it affects all of us, in one directly or indirectly, where we all know cases of diabetes, and we all know that we'd like to move in that direction to help out. I do want to say a little bit about the amendment, and then I'll move on to some of it, but I want to again recall that to the members here, the 4 parties that are here represented here, before the election campaign last year, we all committed to a renewal of the strategy on diabetes. We all committed to it. And I heard earlier, a couple of weeks ago, a speech from the other side, and someone asked them, why are we doing this? Well, we did it in the campaign. I think there was a minister, and I think he's sitting in the House now. Not supposed to mention they're sitting here or not, so excuse me. No name, but he knows, he is smiling, he knows who he is. And he mentioned, well, it was in our platform. And we agreed to that. That's what we ran on. And so I say to the honourable members here, all of you, that we should be supporting this wholeheartedly without amendments. So that's important. I fear with the amendment, Mr. Speaker, I really fear that without reducing the importance of other chronic diseases, that the diabetes will be lost in the shuffle somehow, and I'm concerned about that. Now, with regards to the amendment itself, I spoke on a point of order earlier this week about an amendment that was made by the government, an executive member of the government, executive council, to a motion of a private member's. And they changed the motion. And I still do not think that governments in power that are running the government should be making amendments on private members' bills unless they're friendly amendments. I really do believe that. In this case, when you look at the amendment that was put forth, it could almost be ruled out of order if it wouldn't be. It could be ruled out of order if you look at the reasoning behind it. Because if you look at the original motion, it talks about diabetes. It talks about diabetes instruments. It talks about trying to look at the cost. It's not a commitment. We're not saying, you know, you're committed. If this passes, you're committed. Let's do it. You know, we're saying we're urging the government, look at it, try to do it if you can. We're giving you the option. The amendment doesn't do that. In other words, if you look at those that have motion 59 in front of them, you'll note that diabetes, the word diabetes is mentioned 11 times. 11 times. The amendment took out our resolution, took it right out, deleted all of it, never kept one word, deleted it out. Not one word of diabetes. Not one word. Not one word about cost. Not one word about finances. Nothing. So I say to you, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to raise this now because we will, with time, look at some of the amendments coming down again. But again, I would suspect that this could have been ruled out of order because it has nothing to do, it's a new motion completely. And I know others, House leaders would probably agree with it if they were allowed the freedom to do so. I know it would be ruled out of order basically because it throws out the motion, and if you read the amendment, it could be on any other motion. It could have been done, that could have been done in the last one on the nurses motion. That could have been inserted there. Take everything out, put that in. It's a generic thing. Okay? So it doesn't make sense. I'm very disappointed with that. Okay? And I think we do need comprehensive plans and strategies for chronic diseases. There's no doubt about it. Okay? So what I'm going to do, Mr. Speaker, is help those out that really want a comprehensive on chronic disease. And I heard a couple of ministers say that, and I respect that for them, but I think they'd like to have a comprehensive approach to chronic disease prevention and management. I heard opposition parties and say that they'd like to have the strategy renewed. So I'm going to give the House the best of both worlds. I'm going to give the House the best of both worlds. I'm going to give them the ability to join together, four of us, and support a sub-amendment that I'm ready to place here before the House. And my sub-amendment, moved by myself, seconded by the honourable member from Dieppe, that adding after the word of the first use of the word "to" in the amendment, the following: renew the lapsed provincial comprehensive diabetes strategy and. So that would be my sub-amendment. So you get the best, you get both. You get both.
The sub-amendment moved by the member for Campbellton Dalhousie, seconded by the member from Kent South. The motion 59 be sub-amended, or the amendment on motion 59 be sub-amended by adding after the word first use of "to" in the amendment the following: renew the lapsed provincial comprehensive diabetes strategy and time expired, so we're prepared to vote on the sub-amendment. On the sub-amendment. All those in favor, please say yay. Yay! All those opposed, please say nay. Nay! My opinion, the nays have it. I declare the motion defeated. On the amendment, moved by the Minister of Education and Early Childhood, seconded by the member for Carleton, that motion 59 be amended by removing the resolution clause and replacing it with the following. Be it resolved that the House urge the government to develop a comprehensive approach to chronic disease prevention and management with a broader primary health care framework in collaboration with the regional health authorities and other key stakeholders. On the amendment, all those in favor, please signify by saying yay. Yay! Those opposed, nay. My opinion, the yeas have it. I declare the amendment carried. On the motion, all those in favor will please say yay. Yay. All those opposed, please say nay. Motion's carried, or amended motions carried. Now, I think we have an agreement to revert back to introduction of guests. So I will ask the Premier to allow his guests on the floor and introduce his guests and allow the, as we agreed, his guests to have a few words to the member of this House. So let's bring in the Premier with his guests.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor for me today to rise in the House to recognize a guest with us today, the newly elected Premier of Alberta, the Honourable Jason Kenney, who is making his first official visit to our province. Premier Kenney has had a long and distinguished career in public service. Le Premier ministre Kenney a mené une longue et remarquable carrière au service de la population. Representing Calgary, he was first elected as a Member of Parliament in 1997. He served as a Minister of Citizenship and Immigration and later as Minister of Multiculturalism and Citizenship. He was a trailblazer in his outreach efforts to the new Canadians and has demonstrated the best of Canadian pluralism. He also served as Minister of Employment and Social Development and as the Minister of National Defence. His work ethic knows no bounds, and this is legendary in Ottawa circles. It is no surprise that he was named the hardest working MP in 2011 by Maclean's magazine. He has received numerous awards, including in 2016 when he received the Ukrainian Order of Merit for his steadfast efforts in diplomatic and military affairs. These positions provided him with a breadth of experience and knowledge. He then put the experience he gained in Ottawa to work in his home province of Alberta, where he proved himself yet again as a unifier and as a builder. Il a ensuite mis l'expérience qu'il a acquise à Ottawa au profit de sa province d'origine, l'Alberta. Just a few short months ago, he was elected Premier of Alberta after running a campaign focused on economic growth, something I am also very focused on. We also both understand the urgent need for a national utility corridor. As Canadians, we must take advantage of our own natural resources. It is time to unlock Alberta's stranded resources. We must use them what we have while we in our transition and in a cleaner economy. We have an opportunity to use our own resources. This can be done with a national utility corridor. Working together on different sides of the country, we can grasp the opportunity before us. I look forward to working closely with Premier Kenney on this vital initiative. I am pleased to welcome Premier Kenney on his first official visit to New Brunswick, and I look forward to working with him to advance the priorities of both of our provinces. Alberta and New Brunswick share many of the same goals. I believe we can work together to overcome some of the challenges we face and take positive steps forward on opportunities that will benefit not just our provinces, but Canada as a whole. I invite everyone to join me in welcoming Premier Kenney to the Legislative Assembly and to our beautiful province. Je vous invite à vous joindre à moi pour accueillir le Premier ministre Kenney à l'Assemblée législative et dans notre belle province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Kenney, for joining us.
I would now invite Premier Kenney to the podium to address the members.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Honorable député, Monsieur le Premier ministre, merci de vos mots d'accueil chaleureux. Je suis ravi d'être ici au nom des Albertains et le gouvernement de l'Alberta. C'est mon première visite dans votre législature historique. I'm so honored to join you and on my first visit to this historic Canadian legislature, one of the birthplaces of responsible government in Canada, and to hopefully begin renewing the important ties between Alberta and New Brunswick. Alberta has benefited enormously from the talent and hard work of tens of thousands of New Brunswickers who went west for opportunity. I'm glad many have come home to New Brunswick. Some stayed. We're glad of that too. But we share the hope of the Premier and I'm sure all members that New Brunswick will have partners in the Federation, such as Alberta, to develop your own natural resources and allow more opportunity for those who went west to return home. Let me say that Alberta and New Brunswick have so much in common. Economies that are rooted historically in the responsible development of our resources, but also economies that are increasingly focused on innovation. And I believe we can be strong partners in the Canadian Federation. Les partenaires pour la prospérité. Je remercie l'honorable le Premier ministre pour son dévouement au rêve d'une pipeline nationale de l'ouest à l'est pour que les gens de Nouveau-Brunswick puissent développer les ressources qui sont développées en Alberta. New Brunswick has also benefited tremendously from transfers through our system of fiscal federalism that ultimately have and disproportionately been developed in Alberta. And I appreciate the Premier's recognition of that, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to working with him at the Council of the Federation to strengthen national unity, to be partners in trade, with the development of natural resource corridors, and to support federal policies as well that will help both of our peoples enjoy prosperity. Alors, je vous remercie infiniment et je vais exprimer vos meilleurs sentiments à mes collègues dans la législature de l'Alberta. Merci beaucoup. Vive le Canada.